Poor Things is a well-acted, often funny and artful film with a moral center as empty and retarded as its main protagonist. It's a film that armors itself in its gaudy early 2000s skateboard video aesthetic and the undeniable talent of its performers to disguise its function as hollow do-as-thou-wilt affirmational. Poor Things is the story of Bella Baxter. Not too long ago, Bella was another woman named Victoria Blessington, who after committing suicide was rescued by the mad scientist Godwin Baxter and had the brain of her unborn baby implanted into her body. As Bella's intellect rapidly increases, she becomes more and more curious about life, the world around her, and herself, in particular her sexuality. Initially betrothed to Godwin's assistant Max, Bella instead runs away with the similarly debauched Duncan, charting her on a path of sexually charged self-discovery. Poor Things' effectiveness as a study in female empowerment rests largely on how much you buy into the premise that a woman's soul is in her vagina. Bella's globe-trotting journey of self-actualization, her breaking the chains of patriarchal oppression, is tied almost entirely to her orgasm. That in itself isn't necessarily a bad premise. A film about a woman having sex and liking it isn't the problem. The problem is that Poor Things goes one step further by making Bella's instant gratification the entire center of her universe. It presents a moral framework where maturity, enlightenment, and liberation are a simple process of discovering and pursuing what you want, no matter the collateral damage you might inflict on others along the way. It's a moral framework where the social or personal injustices of the past can be remedied in the cold self-indulgences of the present. One question that arises over the course of Poor Things, but which the film never really touches on, is to what extent are we to consider Bella as a consenting party in all her love affairs? While the film seems to suggest Bella as the primary author of her sexual life, Bella is also introduced as having the brain of a literal baby. While the film seems to suggest Bella's sexuality as an avenue for personal autonomy, it also leaves it vague as to what comparable mental age Bella is supposed to be at any one point in time, and all while playing her emotional and intellectual stunting for laughs. This has some weird implications, to say the least, but it's strange how little the film dwells on it. Is the audience meant to question Bella's autonomy? Are we to infer some notion that all men are rapists under the patriarchy? Good or at least interesting art is often complex and leaves room for different interpretations that are sometimes in complete conflict with one another. I don't think art necessarily has any sort of duty to moral clarity, and I know that the morality of a character and the decisions they make is not necessarily reflective of a belief of the artist or of the narrative as a whole. You could watch Poor Things and your takeaway could be, well, it's complicated. You could watch Poor Things and, like some people have done with the Barbie movie, reinterpret it as some sort of secretly based anti-feminist messaging. When an artist like Yorgos Lanthimos cultivates a certain amount of prestige, I think it then creates a certain expectation on the viewer to come up with all these caveats, to invent all these excuses to strain a broken piece of art into working again, or to confirm it to our preferred morality. I think sometimes both artist and audience gravitate towards ambiguity as a mask to preserve the ideal of the art and the artist, rather than as an invitation to collaborate or present any real sense of complication. For me, though, I don't think Poor Things is much more than it presents itself to be. I think Poor Things is a sincere attempt at feminist affirmational that falls flat on its face. Poor Things often reminded me of the films of Woody Allen and his preoccupation with the romantic lives of young women paired with older men. To be clear, I'm not extending any comparison between Woody Allen and Yorgos Lanthimos to their personal lives. I'm only saying there are some overlapping themes and ideas between Poor Things and something like, say, Manhattan. But okay, let's put all that aside. Let's not take the film so literally. Let's relegate all that to the realm of metaphor and interpret Bella's journey as more that of a space alien discovering Earth and human beings for the first time. David Bowie in The Man Who Fell to Earth. Even then, I don't think the movie is any less morally confused, as over the course of the film, Bella's hedonistic id is transformed into feminist individualist virtue. When Bella runs away from Max to have sex with Mark Ruffalo, only to fool around on him behind his back and send him into a tailspin, all of that is more or less understandable. Ruffalo's character isn't the most sympathetic. He and Bella enter into their relationship purely on the basis of sex, only for him to develop more of an unreciprocated infatuation infatuation. Bella, meanwhile, is still presented as being emotionally and intellectually stunted, and so if she does cross the perfectly reasonable boundary of not letting some other guy go down on her, we can chalk it up more to ignorance than any sort of intentional cruelty. In some sense, we have two equally immature, impulse-driven people, both with different wants and needs, moving in different directions and neither treating the other very well. However, watching Bella apply an analytical sort of lens to these experiences, watching her grow and mature over the course of the film, I, as a normal person, assume part of the lesson here is going to be compromise. One of the hallmarks of maturity is compromise. A mature person, having experienced what Bella has, if she were to lend the same respect to her romantic or sexual partners that she desired for herself, might make the compromise of not fucking other guys, or at least giving some sort of heads up before doing so. Mark Ruffalo, meanwhile, though the story isn't about him, might compromise in trying to be less controlling, and allowing Bella to explore her own pursuits. Instead, Bella finds further enlightenment in prostitution, and it's here that whatever the film might be trying to say about sexual liberation, and by extension the entire notion of freewheeling sex positivity itself, completely breaks down, and that so much of it is dependent on the very modern luxury of moral luck. Bella's worldview and the choices she makes concerning sex are barely ever challenged, so that there's never even the opportunity of showing them as anything other than true or good. The film does suggest some of the emotional toll on other people by way of Mark Ruffalo going into a tailspin, but on the whole it's played for laughs, and the character is so over the top that he's hard to sympathize with. While working as a prostitute, Bella never gets beaten or raped by any of her clients. In all her sexual escapades, she never gets an STD, and the question of whether or not she can still have children never gets brought up. At the brothel, Bella does express some displeasure at the men having their choice of the women, and at the sexual undesirability of some of her clients. Beyond that, Bella's time as a prostitute is treated like she's a staff writer for Vice, dabbling in a bit of radical chic for an article she's working on. She even discovers the joys of lesbian sex and socialism. Hell yeah, girl, we are our own means of production. We've arrived into the Reddit socialist polyamorous synchronicity. Never mind the women forced into prostitution, the women who do it because they're desperate and they have no other choice. In the feminist sex-positive worldview, sex work is seen as liberation from the ills of capitalist patriarchy, from a world in which women were historically prohibited from the workforce and financially beholden to men. This sex-positive worldview works well enough for people whose primary frame of reference for sex work is OnlyFans models and used bathwater saleswomen, but it strikes me as much less cut and dry for someone in Bella's position, and in general less applicable to a less modernized definition of sex work. I understand Poor Things is supposed to be a kind of surrealist fairy tale, but all this examination of patriarchy and the pitfalls of polite society would probably have a lot more weight if Bella didn't also seem to inhabit a parallel universe where she already has the benefit of birth control and penicillin. It's easy to create this parable of the immaculately self-emancipated woman when you completely ignore all the material conditions that even make those aspirations possible. Again, I don't think the best way of watching a movie is necessarily to try and divine some sort of moral prescription from the text, but when Poor Things consistently presents one point of view and then never challenges it in the most obvious ways, this is where I go, oh, okay, is the film actually meant to be some sort of secretly based satire of this modern notion of the morally lucky, consequence-free girl boss? By the end, Bella becomes a doctor, for Christ's sake. It's fine, we could just hand-wave away the years of medical training. She's a doctor now because she's a woman and women can do anything. It's so silly you have to wonder, is the moral of the story supposed to be that women who lead their lives like Bella are amoral sociopaths who, if given the chance, will rip out their enemies' brains and subjugate them as animals? On that note, let's return to the idea of maturity and compromise, this time by way of the character Max. At the end of the film, Bella returns to Max. They get married. Max is very supportive, even as Bella invites her former, maybe even current, lesbian lover to live with them. Again, it's my opinion that one hallmark of maturity, of any healthy relationship, is compromise, and by this point in the film it appears that Max and Bella have arrived at one. In this case, the compromise seems to be that Max, Mr. Nice Guy, will try to discard his primitive Victorian notions about the frailty of women, will rid himself of any notion of women as some inert plaything plaything, put there purely for his self-esteem and his sexual enjoyment. Bella, meanwhile, after returning from a whirlwind adventure in which she gave out her body like it was free samples at the grocery store, her compromise is that she will bestow Max with her presence.
I find myself merely jealous of the men's time with you, rather than any moral aspersion against you. It is your body, Bella Baxter, yours to give freely.
Gosh, it sure is lucky that Max is so understanding. It sure is lucky that Max has the exact same relationship standards as a fat, sweaty Reddit mod in a Seattle polycule. Surely, for most normal, self-respecting people, there's a happy medium between I'll try harder to respect your autonomy as a woman and, yeah girl, it's totally cool, you can fuck whatever, what do I care? What about Bella? Does Bella love Max? Has she ever loved anyone? Does love in the moral framework of Poor Things require a certain level of detachment? Is the suggestion supposed to be that monogamy and fidelity are just a function of patriarchal polite society? Luckily for us, Poor Things sidesteps those questions, like it sidesteps so many others throughout the film, before finally retrieving its brightly colored clothes from the headboard, putting them back on, and running off to another booty call, leaving the viewer to marinate in a pool of mingled, stinky sweat and wonder what all that loud, furious jumping had been for.